Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thanks Steve for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me back here again. This afternoon I'm going to talk about the pilots of Aéropostale. I hope we don't have too many French speakers here today, because my pronunciation of French words is probably not going to be perfect, but I'll try anyway. In the 1920s and 30s, Aéropostale's intrepid aviators pushed the boundaries of flight. They braved treacherous weather, uncharted territories and unreliable technology in their machines to deliver mail across vast distances that were often uncharted. Aéropostale's motto was "Le courrier doit passer," which means the mail must get through. Which is, interestingly, it's the same as the Pony Express's. Their motto was the same: the mail must go through sleet and snow and night and day and so on. And Aéropostale had that same attitude. I'll also briefly look at the lives of some of the key figures involved in early French aviation. The company that was the leader in mail postal deliveries at the time, and their pilots, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, Henri Guillaumet and Jean Mermoz, who played key roles in establishing mail routes throughout France to West Africa, North Africa, and across the South Atlantic to Argentina, Brazil and Chile. There's too much history, of course, in all of this to fit in just one short presentation, but I'll probably just give you a little bit of a taste today, and you can follow it up later if you wish. I'm going to look at the history of the company, the challenges that the aviators faced, then look at these figures, key figures as I mentioned. Pierre-Georges Latécoère. Latécoère was the founder of company that still exists today. It did produce many types of planes, and seaplanes in particular, in the early part of the 20th century, and is still in business today, providing parts for companies like Airbus, Dassault and Embraer. Look briefly at the lives of these people, and then the legacy of these pilots, and come up with some conclusions. Factory that you can see there is a factory of Latécoère planes being finished, Latécoère 28s. So let's have a look at the history of the company and the final route that it took. Over a short period of 15 years, it extended its routes from Toulouse. Its home base was in Toulouse, in the south of France, to Barcelona, Casablanca in Morocco, Dakar in Senegal, which is in West Africa, and then across to South America, Rio de Janeiro, and then finally across to Santiago in Chile. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. From 1918 to 1922. 1918, Pierre-Georges Latécoère founded the company. It wasn't called Aéropostale at that stage. It was Société des Lignes Latécoère. So his name was wedded to the company's fortunes. He hired his friend Didier Dora as the operations director, and an Italian who became a naturalized Frenchman, Beppo Di Massimi, as his chief pilot and pilot trainer. The Great War, World War I, was still ongoing when Latécoère had this crazy dream. He said, "I've reviewed all my calculations. It looks impossible, but there's only one thing left to do. Let's make it happen." And that "let's make it happen" was embraced by everyone who worked for Latécoère and flew for them, and they did eventually realise his crazy dream that we'll see later on. After quite a bit of preparation, in 1919, Latécoère took off from Toulouse on the 8th of March and reached Morocco. He actually wasn't a pilot, but he had a pilot with him. Reached Morocco after 11 hours and 45 minutes. He delegated Beppo Di Massimi, his chief pilot, to negotiate with the Spanish government for overflight authorization, because even back then governments were requiring pilots and airline companies to gain permission before they were allowed to fly over them. Early planes that they used were Breguet 14s. Breguet 14s were light bombers used in the Great War. Latécoère bought about a dozen of these. They were metal frame, largely metal frame, duralumin, which was an aluminium alloy, and fabric covering. They were biplanes, like the one that you can see there. By 1922, they had postal flights between Casablanca, Toulouse and Casablanca running daily. And in addition to the mail, the same year nearly 1,000 passengers had travelled between France and Africa. One of the things that Latécoère was really keen on was getting daily flights. He said, people write postcards, they write letters every day, so why can't we fly every day? And that way the whole enterprise will make sense. He wasn't pure though, of course. The whole venture needed government subsidies. And if it wasn't for government subsidies, they wouldn't have been able to do this. So after he had got his flights going to Casablanca, he set his sights on a new objective, Dakar, in the west of Africa. You can see on the map there that you are, to reach Dakar, you're going to be flying over some very, very hostile territory in places like Morocco, and that part of Morocco was controlled by the Spanish, and Mauritania. So there was, it was quite a dangerous undertaking to fly to Dakar. They had sandstorms. They had to fix their engines under the blazing sun, or risk being captured by bands of nomadic tribesmen. And this was quite a common occurrence. If a pilot had to put the plane down anywhere in the desert, if he wasn't killed outright, he'd be ransomed, or held to ransom until the ransom was paid. And you can imagine how difficult it would have been to make those arrangements back in those days. So by 1924, they had the first postal journey between Alicante in Spain and Algeria, and that was in a seaplane which was piloted by a pilot named Paul Vacher and a radio navigator, the first radio navigator, one Munar Mati, the first radio navigator in commercial aviation. The US Navy had developed radio navigation in 1920, but it took 4 years before it was adopted in commercial aviation. So by 1925, the Casablanca to Dakar route was opened, and by then the Latécoère line totaled 5,000 kilometres. But there was still a lot to be done, and Latécoère's next mission was to establish the foundations of the line in South America. So he dispatched 3 pilots to Buenos Aires to fly north and south, look for landing spots and possible refueling spots. There's no infrastructure, of course, flying over the jungles and rivers. But that was his aim. And he eventually achieved that in the third part of our history here. Interestingly, the first air transatlantic journey from Spain to Africa wasn't done by the French, but by Spanish, and the pilot was named Ramon Franco, and he was the brother of General Franco, of infamy, later infamy in Spain. And Ramon Franco flew via the Cape Verde Islands to get to Brazil. Took about 60 hours to fly 10,000 odd kilometres. And towards the end of this year, Pierre-Georges Latécoère landed in Buenos Aires and negotiated the delivery of mail to both Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay. That was over the Christmas New Year period. When he got back to France, the legacy of too many crashes and too much competition and various other financial worries caused him to sell his company. He sold it to another Frenchman, and the Latico airline became Aéropostale. The new management built new hangars, wireless telegraphy stations and so on, and in early March 1928, Jean Mermoz, who we'll see more of later, flew the first batches of airmail between Buenos Aires and Rio. Normally the sea voyage between Buenos Aires and Rio took 5 days, so mail would take 5 days to go in any direction. But Mermoz realised that by not flying at night, they were losing some of the advantage over sea mail. And so he instituted probably the first commercial night flights in that area. They then set their sights on flying over the Andes, which I think you can imagine, flying in these biplanes with ceilings of 4,500 metres, perhaps 5,000 metres, was pretty challenging. There were various attempts to find a route between the east and west coasts of South America, and I'll talk about a couple of those attempts a bit later on. To get the mail across the Atlantic, Didier Dora, our operations manager, proposed putting floats on the Latico airplanes because it was a much better idea. Of course, you had somewhere you could land if you were in trouble, or at least land at sea if you were in trouble. And at 1930, in May the 12th, 1930, Mermoz and his navigator and radio operator took off from Senegal and landed 21 hours later in Natal, the first non-stop transatlantic crossing of the South Atlantic. By that stage, once they inaugurated the mail deliveries, the Latico airline totaled nearly 13,000 kilometres, and Latico Air's crazy dream was now a reality. However, in October 1933, the French government was looking around the world and saw all these other national airlines being developed and decided that France needed a national airline as well. So it forced mergers between various companies, including Aéropostale, and that became Air France. Now, skipping forward to 2001, on March 25th, an Air France pilot, Gérard Meillat, and his crew flew direct from Paris to Santiago aboard a Boeing 777-200 in 14 hours and 20 minutes, more than satisfying Latico Air's crazy dream. So I don't think I need to dwell too much on the challenges of early aviation. I've mentioned a couple of them already. Some of the planes that were being used were the Breguet 14 and various models of plane developed by Latico Air himself. Some were biplanes and some were monoplanes. The navigation methods used before radio navigation came into vogue. Obviously the pilots were using visual navigation, dead reckoning, celestial navigation, or a combination of the two or three. And of course that is not always accurate, so many pilots were lost. The weather of course, along the entire route varied quite a lot, with huge sandstorms in Africa, fog over the Atlantic Ocean, particularly fog that lasted a long time, and snow in the Andes. And the mechanical issues, the engine failures that occurred frequently. The early Breguets, I think 1 flight in 5 generally developed engine trouble of some sort. So it was a pretty difficult task. And there were, of course, limited repair facilities en route. And then there were physical and psychological challenges for the pilots of long distances by themselves in many cases, and then the threat of being captured by nomadic bandits if they landed in the desert. I'm going to look at these key figures as I mentioned, and the first one is Pierre-Georges Latico, who wasn't actually a pilot, but he was the visionary founder who saw the potential in aviation for mail delivery. His family had a sawmill business, but he turned to aviation during the Great War and started manufacturing aircraft. In fact, they manufactured, among other planes, the Samson aircraft and had a rush order for 600 of those towards the end of the war. And in 1918, he bought these military surplus Breguet 14s and founded his airline. He obviously sought to secure government subsidies to fund the expansion of his routes. And then later in his career, he stepped back from the day-to-day operations. And as I said before, the business is still going today. But it was his vision that laid the foundations for what would become Air France. And he played a crucial role in developing French commercial aviation. The operations manager, Didier Dorat, he was a real taskmaster. He made all his pilots learn how to disassemble and reassemble their engines before they took off. That was part of their training. They had to know how the engines worked intimately. He's also famous for this quote, "I don't need acrobats, I want bus drivers. Go and join the circus." And that was a message he delivered to one hopeful pilot who failed his entry exam into the company. I did find one other quotation that was attributed to Didier Dorat, but I'm not sure it's actually true. And it was, "I don't pay you to fly, I pay you to land." And it sounds like him. It really does. It sounds like the kind of guy he was, but just unfortunately, I don't think it was. He had a strict, no-nonsense approach to running operations. He tested all of the pilots, and he was deeply concerned with pilot safety and in improving aviation practices. In the first years of the airline, when there was no radio, of course, what do you think the pilots did to communicate if they had a crash or anything else happened?
Burn the aeroplane.
They didn't burn the aeroplane, no, they wouldn't quite do that. They had carrier pigeons with them, had carrier pigeons on board. So that's how they communicated, basically. If there was a problem, if you ended up in the Western Sahara Desert with a tribesman holding a knife at your throat, the only way you could communicate would be by releasing the carrier pigeon. Of course, that was not a perfect result, perfect strategy, and eventually he started encouraging pilots to fly in pairs, so that one could always keep an eye on the other. It was not very efficient or say productive in terms of revenue, but that was one of the things he did. He also armed them, gave them guns in case they needed it. And he also sent interpreters, although the interpreters were monolingual, they weren't bilingual, but the whole point of taking the interpreter was to have someone who could negotiate the ransom, which was always going to be paid. One of the issues was obviously finding places to stop en route to refuel, for the pilots to rest and so on. And one of those spots was Cape Juby. And he needed someone to manage the station, Cape Juby, and he assigned Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who we'll meet later on, to be station manager there. And in fact, station manager meant that he had to find pilots who got lost in the desert and bring them back. So that was his job, essentially. He would get up every morning, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, fly the 4 planes that they had there at the station to remove the condensation, and then since at that stage, in the early stages, the planes were only flying through once a week, he'd have 6 or 7 days to get about other business, rescuing pilots that may have been stranded, or teaching card tricks to the locals, magic tricks and so on, and writing books. Saint-Exupéry was a pilot poet and author, and his work is renowned even today. He actually saw himself as the St. Bernard of the Sahara. You know, the dogs that carry the water and to rescue people in the Swiss Alps. He figured he had a similar role. Eventually, Didier Dorard left Aéropostale when it became Air France, and he founded an airline, a male-only airline called Air Bleu. But that didn't last very long because they weren't able to compete with overnight trains in France. It was domestic only. And then he joined Air France after World War II as operations manager, as a key figure in establishing the professionalism of the aviation business in France. The third member is also a key person, Giuseppe or Beppo Di Massimi, Italian man who trained many of the company's aviators, and he was the guy that went out to negotiate overflight authorization from various countries. He was an observer in the French Air Force in the Great War. After he left Aéropostale, he established the airline I mentioned before, Air Bleu, with Didier Dorard. Probably the most well-known of the pilots, I guess, here in Australia or in the Western English-speaking world. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, born in 1900 in Lyon, to an aristocratic family. Now, it was an aristocratic family. They had a castle with 1,000 rooms, but unfortunately they had no money, which doesn't help very much. They were a provincial aristocratic family. Throughout his life, his money troubles caused him more grief than anything else. He was a bit of a ladies' man, and he had a love of his life, Louise de Valmorin, who was a member of a Parisian aristocratic family, and her parents were horrified that she was going to be engaged to a pilot. And they gave him an ultimatum: you either give up flying or you give up your fiancée. He did give up flying for a couple of years. He tried to get a job, or he did get a job as in a factory, working in the office, but really hated it and came back to flying. Just going back a little bit before that though, he joined the military in 1921 after he was called up. He asked to be assigned to an aviation group, and he was assigned to the 2nd Fighter Group near Strasbourg, working as ground crew. He didn't qualify for flight training. So he bribed people to teach him to fly, and was eventually able to scrape up some money to pay for private training in the Air Force. And he started flying in a Farman F-40, Farman F-40 plane. Farman was a French manufacturer, we'll see a few times. He joined the Latico airline in 1926, and he was an hour late for his interview, which just infuriated Didier Dorard, the operations manager, because he was a stickler for punctuality. This guy, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, his head was in the clouds most of the time. He was a poet, he loved writing, he loved women, loved flying more than anything else, and he loved his free time, which he indulged all the time. As I said, he was assigned to Cape Juby for nearly a year, and his job involved rescuing pilots, kidnapped pilots, negotiating with tribesmen, paying ransoms, and conducting repairs on damaged aircraft. He loved card games, card tricks, word games, and so on. And curious game, I don't know if any of you have played Wordle. It's claimed that he invented a kind of two-handed Wordle, where two people would sit at a table and they would each think up a 6-letter word. And one person would say, okay, what about the letter A? And the other person would say, yes, its correct position is 3rd letter along, or whatever. And so he's credited with inventing that game. Not sure exactly, but yes, that's one of the sort of things that he did. He loved competing with people. He'd play cards through the night, then get up and fly without sleep the next day. Eventually, of course, Cape Juby fell into disuse as aircraft had increased ranges, and so it wasn't necessary for them to stop. He flew quite extensively for Latico Air and Aéropostale, and some of his flying was involved in developing the routes in South America. And this is a photograph of landing at Comodoro Rivadavia in Patagonia. And it's quite amazing, the story of what they had to do to land planes in this area. The winds could blow as strongly as 125 miles an hour. You could often struggle to land a plane and often weren't able to land a plane. De Saint-Exupéry mentioned once that it took him 5 hours to fly 150 miles, and then on the return journey it only took 1 hour. Another time he was 600 feet off the coast and couldn't get any further. He had to turn back and go to his takeoff point. Another time he took off from Rio Gallegos, and after an hour he could still see the airport he'd left. And it just got worse, because the further south you went, the stronger the winds became. And so they had to resort to all sorts of crazy techniques to get the plane down. So at Comodoro Rivadavia, at the airstrip there, the plane would come in at full throttle and match its speed to the wind, and then a cart would be placed underneath the tail skid of the plane, and then they have 12 or 15 soldiers who would come up with these hooks on the end of poles and insert them into eyes in the wings of the aircraft to hold it down. And then they would manage to move the whole apparatus, the plane and the cart, with its engine, with the propeller still going full throttle, along the airstrip and into the hangar where they could finally turn the engine off. It didn't always go smoothly. It probably never went smoothly, but one time a gust of wind picked up one wing of the plane and threw the guys on one side over the top and killed 2 of them. So it was a really dangerous enterprise. Saint-Exupéry had several crashes throughout his lifetime. Another one, he competed in 1935 in the Paris to Saigon air race in a plane, a Caudron plane that was specially designed for him. The prize was pretty good, 1.2 million French francs for the winner. But he crashed in the Libyan desert, and with his navigator they had some grapes, 2 oranges, a flask of coffee, half a pint of wine, and of course a Madeleine. And they lasted 4 days before they were rescued. So he had some amazing adventures. He had plenty of time to write. He also wrote in the plane quite a lot as well. Whenever he was flying, he'd be writing or thinking about writing. He wrote works such as Southern Mail, Night Flight, Wind, Sand and Stars, the French titles of course, but his most famous novel, or short novel, was The Little Prince. You might have heard of The Little Prince. It's a children's book, but it has adult themes running through it too, themes of loneliness and despair and imagination and so on. And it was influenced by his experiences in the desert. Little Prince has sold more than 200 million copies worldwide. It's probably one of the most translated books next to the Bible. And his books weren't released in France until after the war, because he had a kind of ambiguous relationship with the government. Of course, he was anti the Vichy government in France, and he was very keen for the Americans to get involved in the war, so he ended up going to America and staying in New York to try and encourage the Americans to enter the war. But he wasn't really keen on General de Gaulle, and part of the reason he didn't like General de Gaulle was because de Gaulle gave the okay for the bombing of the French fleet in Algeria. The Allies were really concerned that the Germans would get hold of the French naval fleet, and so to stop that, the Allies bombed the French fleet, resulting in the deaths of many hundreds or thousands of Frenchmen, French sailors. So it was a very tricky time, and he wasn't keen on de Gaulle. So as I said, he went to America for a while. He said he was a ladies' man. He actually had a fling, we believe, with another famous pilot's wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh's wife. She wrote a dedication in a book of his, and he wrote a dedication in a book of hers, and apparently in her diary she asked her husband for forgiveness, and I think her husband said, "What for?" Yes, she spoke French, and de Saint-Exupéry could never really speak English very well, so he was a bit limited with his social life in America. By the time the Second World War came around, I mean, he was born in 1901, so he wasn't particularly old, in his mid to late 30s, but he was suffering from the results of many crashes, so his bones and muscles weren't great. He also had lots of real and imaginary illnesses. He was a bit of a hypochondriac. He thought he had stomach cancer once, and it took a while before he realised he didn't. But he tried to join and successfully join the US Air Force. The US Air Force generals thought that it would be a good idea to have somebody of high profile join them. It would help with the war effort, with the propaganda. And he was assigned to a division a unit that flew P-38 Lightnings. And in particular, they did a lot of reconnaissance work over the south of France. And if you remember 1944, after the D-Day landings, the Allies invaded France from the south on Operation Dragoon, and they worked their way northwards from there. And the work that the unit that Saint-Exupéry was flying with were charged with doing surveillance missions over there. And as I said, he flew these planes, and he was a disaster. He'd take a book up with him to read, and he wouldn't come down until he'd finished reading. So sometimes he'd be flying around, circling above the airfield, the ground crew waiting for him, and he would come down when he was good and ready. A couple of times he forgot to put down his landing gear until almost too late. He cooked several engines and even flew one mission on one engine because he forgot to turn it on the other, and was flying around with the propeller rotating, and he thought that was okay, but in fact it was just the wind making the propeller rotate. Just really totally absent-minded. They did try to ground him, but the generals said, look, keep him going. Anyway, 80 years ago, on July the 31st, 1944, he took off on his last flight over the south of France, never returned. 8 days later, he was declared missing in action, presumed shot down by the enemy. And exactly what happened that day, nobody really knows. But in 1998, a French fisherman found his identity bracelet in the ocean off Marseille. And later, divers found the remains of the aircraft in the same area. The plane was inspected, but no one could find any evidence of it being shot down by enemy aircraft. So obviously something else happened on that flight. De Saint-Exupéry is celebrated in popular culture. As I mentioned, the Little Prince is his greatest work. The John Barrymore movie and Clark Gable movie, Night Flight, is also celebrating his flying, and he's been the subject of many stamps and currency notes around the world, particularly in South America. Saint-Exupéry is celebrated there. And the background photo that you can see there, the little plane over the desert, is even today. This is a song that was composed back in 2014, I think, which also talks about Saint-Exupéry and his flights. And finally, for Saint-Exupéry, he's also remembered in the Lyon airport, which I think you'll agree is a pretty smart design. It's a very, very smart design. And this was renamed Lyon Saint-Exupéry Airport in the year 2000 on the anniversary of his birth. Moving on from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who's probably, as I said, the best known in the English-speaking world of these pilots I'll talk about today. A second one is a pilot called Henri Guillaumet, and good-looking young rooster. He was another ladies' man. You can see magazine photo on the left-hand side, then his photo when he was in the Air Force, the French Air Force, in the middle. On the bottom left-hand side is a photograph of Henri in the dark-coloured suit and Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and they're in the cockpit of that plane on the right, a gigantic plane, a 6-engine double-decker flying boat called a Latécoère 521. Those were the days, I think, these planes. These two guys made the first non-stop transatlantic crossing from Biscarrosse, near Bordeaux, to New York in 1939, taking 27 hours and 28 minutes. And I believe there's a museum of seaplanes in this place, Biscarrosse. So if you ever go to France again and you're in the vicinity of Bordeaux, there's, I think the word is hydroplane or something. I think the word hydroplane, I think, in French. So as I mentioned, Henri Guillaumet was served in the French Air Force, 1921 to 1923. He joined Aéropostale in 1926. Didier Dorat, the operations manager, said he was the company's best pilot. He flew most of the routes the company had, but some of his most memorable experiences occurred in the South American region. And but his experience had made him a first-rate pilot, and on the Buenos Aires-Santiago route, he had flown the route 21 times before, but on the 22nd flight in 1930, this happened. And I'll read this because it's quite fascinating. At an altitude of 6,500 meters, Guillaumet ran into a huge storm in the Potez 25. That was the model of plane they were using at the time. The Potez 25 had a higher ceiling than the Breguet 14, so it was a little bit better for negotiating those passes through the Andes. He sat down near a lake that he knew, Laguna del Diamante. When he tried to take off again, a layer of snow 80 centimetres deep turned his plane over. He tried to stay warm under his plane and could occasionally hear other planes that had been sent to rescue him, but he wasn't able to see them. After a few days, in sub-zero temperatures, he decided to walk to civilization, dressed in his leather pilot suit and an overcoat. His shoes were totally inappropriate for walking in the snow. He had gloves and a headband, a compass and a flashlight, some matches and a small burner, and his food was 2 cans of sardines, some canned beef, 2 cans of condensed milk, some biscuits and half a bottle of rum. Mail bags in his parachute silk, tucked them carefully into the plane, and then took a rock and inscribed on the side of the plane, "Wasn't spotted by planes, heading east, farewell to all. My last thoughts are of my wife." And he had obviously not only the love for his wife, but he was concerned for her financial welfare as well. The insurance policies that these pilots had, in the case of a pilot vanishing without trace, there was a mandatory 4-year waiting period before the insurance would be paid out. And he was determined that if he was going to die, he was going to be found. So he was very concerned about that. He wanted to be easily found. He walked through the Andes for 3 days and 3 nights and eventually collapsed at the feet of a shepherd who was out looking for him almost a week after he'd crashed. The plane and the mail were discovered when the snow melted. The envelopes carried on that journey were eventually forwarded to their addressees with the message stamped "delayed due to postal service." We can see in the picture there's a Potez 25, the Laguna del Diamante, a beautiful lake, which probably didn't look so beautiful for him, and one of those envelopes which I mean, you can buy a lot of this stuff on eBay if you've got enough money. There are some serious collectors of Aéropostale mail and so on. Guillaume said to his friend Saint-Exupéry a very famous line in French. I don't think it's so famous in English, but you might see it when you do some reading. "What I have done, I swear to you, no animal would have done." And he's referring to being able to walk out of the mountains as he did. There's a picture of his upturned plane. There are various comic books and graphic novels showing his plane. And the picture in the middle is a movie called Wings of Courage. Has anyone seen Wings of Courage? No? Well, you can look it up on YouTube when you get home after you've looked at the Old Fliers Group YouTube channel. It stars some people who I don't know. Craig Sheffer plays Henri Guillaume, Tom Hulse plays Saint-Exupéry, and Jean Mermoz, who I'll speak about next, is played by the guy in the picture, Val Kilmer. And it's the story of Guillaume and his crash in the Andes and subsequent rescue. And what's really fascinating about this movie, it was the first IMAX movie made of a first dramatic IMAX movie made. And that was in 1995. IMAX had been around for a few years before that, but they were mainly documentaries, you know, penguins and eagles flying and so on. And this was the first, say full length, it's only about an hour long, first full length drama movie that was made in the IMAX format. So that's pretty good for Henri. Was a great pilot and inspired many people. But like many of the other pilots for Aéropostale, died young. He continued flying for Air France after the Aéropostale merger, but joined the Free French Forces in World War II, flying missions to transport personnel and supplies. In November 1940, he was flying a quadrimotor Farman F223 plane bound for Syria. He was taking the new High Commissioner for Syria and the Levant to his post there, and was shot down mistakenly by an Italian fighter over the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean, and his body was never recovered. So that was the end of Henri Guillaume. But there's something really interesting about this plane. The Farman F223 was a bomber, and it's got the distinction of being the first Allied plane to bomb Berlin. On the 7th of June 1940, a Farman 223 named Jules Verne, of course, bombed Berlin, dropped a total of 2,800 kilograms of bombs on the capital, but they missed any targets. So it was really symbolic rather than anything else, and perhaps psychological. And there was another raid repeated 3 days later, but I was fascinated to find that out about this particular plane. So now we move on to the third of our pilots, Jean Mermoz, who's also hugely celebrated in France and also had experiences in the Andes, which I'll talk about shortly. Born in 1901, joined the French Air Force in 1920 and learned to fly at the Military Aviation School in Istres. There is a book that I've mentioned at the end in the references that does tell the story of Saint-Exupéry, Jean Mermoz and Henri Guillaume, but it's sort of slightly fiction. It's based on fact, but it's quite interesting and tells some interesting stories about Mermoz at flying school, if you like, in the military. He joined Aéropostale in 1924, and as he was the one who nearly failed his entry exam, he took his plane up at the Toulouse airfield and did all sorts of aerobatic tricks, thinking he'd impress Didier Dorat, and of course Dorat said, "No, I don't need acrobats, I want bus drivers. Why don't you go and join the circus?" And Mermoz was very disconsolate and walked off to the pilot's room and started getting changed when Dorat called him back and said, "Look, I'll give you a second chance. Go up and show me what you can do properly. And he did, and he became a pilot with the company. He really set a pattern very soon for being a reliable and an excellent airman. He was honoured for flying 120,000 kilometres in 1 year, and he'd become one of Aéropostale's key pilots and able to fly its most challenging routes. He was stranded in the desert once on a flight between Casablanca and Dakar, and made an emergency landing in Mauritania. He was captured and held prisoner until a ransom was paid, and he was pretty lucky at that time because, as I mentioned before, the first choice of the tribesmen was to kill the pilot, and then maybe think about negotiating a ransom afterwards. But he obviously talked his way out of it, I think. Mermoz also flew in the Andes, and like many of the others, crashed from time to time. He was looking for shorter routes between Argentina and Chile. If they didn't find a short route, the actual route from Buenos Aires to Santiago in Chile would be increased by 1,600 kilometres because they'd have to get around the mountains. He was able to achieve one route, which was pretty good, but the company was still pushing him to find better routes. And once he was on a new flight path, and they had a carburettor problem, and he brought the sputtering plane down on an ice shelf just short of a ravine, and he pulled the plane up just before it went over the edge. They fixed the carburettor and then essentially started the engine, dropped off the side of the mountain to get airspeed, and continued on their way. Later on that year, they were looking for another passage through the Andes, and he spotted a passage rising to 4,500 metres, and he was trying to take advantage of the updrafts around the side of the mountain, but of course, as you know, the updrafts often take often near downdrafts as well. And they pushed his plane towards the other side of the slope, and with full throttle on, he was powerless against the wind's velocity and knew he was out of choices and they had to land. They landed at an altitude of about 4,000 metres, he and his co-pilot. The plane was severely damaged, and they knew they needed to make the necessary repairs to get home. And I'll read this quote from a letter he wrote to someone. 3 days and 2 nights at 400 metres altitude, 16 to 20 degrees below zero, starving, my mechanic having forgotten the reserve food, repairing our landing gear very slightly sagged on one side and our tail unit a little torn off on a ledge of rocks. Water pipes burst from the cold, repairs made with insulating tape and enamel. Take-off after 3 kilometres of jumps across 3 ravines and attempt to catch an updraft. Ceiling of the plane maximum 4,500 metres. Full engine speed 1,580 turns or 330 horsepower. I had spotted in advance the places where I had to touch the wheels to make the planned jumps. Everything went well, and 40 minutes later I landed back at my starting point. It's quite amazing. After this, he was given the nickname of L'Archange, the Archangel, due to his exceptional flying skills and luck in getting out of sticky situations. The photograph you can see of some mountains there in Patagonia, and one of them is named after Mermoz and the other after Guillaume. That's not where they were, but that's how well regarded they were. Mermoz pioneered night flights across the South Atlantic as well, and his first non-stop commercial air crossing of the South Atlantic was in 1930 from Senegal to Natal in Brazil in 21 hours in a pontoon-equipped Latico Air 28. Remember I said Didier Dorat figured that it would be a good idea to have pontoons and convert these Latico Air 28s into hydravions or seaplanes. And there's a great description of, I think somebody mentioned they'd read Wind, Sand and Stars. A great description of Mermoz's flight from West Africa, and I'll just read it if you don't mind. Thus, when Mermoz first crossed the South Atlantic in a hydroplane, as day was dying, he ran afoul of the black hole region in Africa, off Africa. Straight ahead of him were the tails of tornadoes rising minute by minute, gradually higher, rising as a wall is built, and then night came down upon these preliminaries and swallowed them up. And when an hour later he slipped under the clouds, he came out into a fantastic kingdom. Great black water spouts had reared themselves seemingly in the immobility of temple pillars. Swollen at their tops, they were supporting the squat and lowering arch of the tempest, but through the rifts in the arch there fell slabs of light, and the full moon sent her radiant beams between the pillars down upon the frozen tiles of the sea. Through these uninhabited ruins Mermoz made his way, gliding slantwise from one channel of light to the next, circling round those giant pillars in which there must have rumbled the upsurge of the sea, flying for 4 hours through these corridors of moonlight toward the exit from the temple. And this spectacle was so overwhelming that only after he had got through the black hole did Mermoz awaken to the fact that he had not been afraid. He set several aviation records over the years, and he was not only an admired colleague but also a hero to many French people. You can see his Latticoair 28-3 there that he was flying. But he too died young. After leaving Aéropostale, he went to Argentina and together with Saint-Exupéry was instrumental in establishing air routes in South America. He was responsible for establishing or helping establish Aerolíneas Argentina, the Argentine airline, and he was also appointed Inspector General of Air France in 1933. On December the 7th, 1936, he took off from Dakar, Senegal in a Latticoair 300 that you can see there, another one of these giant flying boats. Things didn't go so smoothly. He left at 6 o'clock in the morning. He returned to base saying that one of the variable pitch propellers is not going fast. Wanted to switch to a different plane. But Henri Guillaume told him that there were no others available and they should just do the repairs and take off again. So Mermoz said, quick, let's do it, we won't waste any time, and took off just before 7. At around 10 they had a radio message from Mermoz saying everything was fine, but 3/4 of an hour later the radio operator sent back a message saying, we're cutting the right rear engine. And that was the last that was heard of them. Henri Guillaume took up his plane looking for them for several days, but no one ever found them. He's still an important figure in French aviation and aviation generally, and an inspiration to adventurers. And that's the same with all the Aéropostale pilots. I think if we look at what their legacy was, they inspired numerous pilots and explorers over the years. Of course, they contributed to mapping and charting remote areas. If it wasn't for them, they actually had influence on military aviation tactics in the Second World War. They were leaders in the establishment of emergency landing strips and weather stations along the routes, and their experiences led to a better understanding of global weather patterns, of course. They formed the basis for Air France network as it is today, and finally they had a huge influence on French literature and popular culture, as exemplified by The Little Prince and the other works that Saint-Exupéry wrote. And there are several biographies of Mermoz and Guillaume that you can get your hands on. Some of them are in French, so they might be a little difficult to read, but they of course inspired other aviator authors. I've picked out a few that will be familiar to you. Richard Bach, who of course wrote Jonathan Livingston's Seagull, and he was a well-known pilot. In fact, a trilogy of Saint-Exupéry's books were published in the, I think it was 1984, and Richard Bach wrote an introduction to that, so it's a nice little crossover. Charles Lindbergh was an author, as was his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh. Beryl Markham, I think we have a couple of people with roots in Africa here. She wrote West with the Night, which was her memoirs of flying in Africa. And of course Amelia Earhart, and we've all know Ernest K. Gann, who's also a great writer in the same tradition, and Robert Scott Jr., who wrote God is My Co-Pilot. So there's a grand tradition of aviator pilots, aviator authors, and I think our French pilots would be well satisfied with who came after them. If you want to do more reading, the definitive biography of Saint-Exupéry is this book by Stacey Schiff. It's probably a bit long, really. It's very, very detailed, but it's a good read. And of course, any of the books by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and translated into English are worth reading. And there are a couple of French books there that are also quite fascinating. And the final book there, Antonio Iterbe, The Prince of the Skies, is loosely based on fact of the lives of Mermoz, Guillaumet and Saint-Exupéry. And that's my story of the French pilots of Aéropostale. I hope I've given you a little taste about what they experienced, and I hope it inspires you to read more about it. I really, really enjoyed reading about their lives. It was really a fascinating experience to do the research. I can't imagine the troubles that they went through, but they loved doing what they did, and I bet they wouldn't have swapped it for any other career. Thank you very much indeed.